Hi, it's Mark Raven. I want to share a bonus episode with you today. This is a posting of an episode from the My Favorite Mistake podcast series. This is episode 137 with the author Daniel H. Pink. Dan Pink is the author of a new book I think you'll find really interesting, and we talk about it here today. It's called The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. And that's a perfect topic to explore in the My Favorite Mistake podcast when we talk about learning from mistakes, how mistakes often lead to regret, and how we can move forward from all of that in a positive, constructive way that's based more on learning from our mistakes and preventing future regrets, if you will. So Dan was a guest in this podcast series back in 2010, episode 107. You can find that in the archives back in the podcast feed, or you can go to leanblog.org/107. Then we talked about his wonderful book called Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. So he's got a new book out. Again, it's great. I think it's an important topic, and I think something that's important for lean practitioners to think about, again, on that theme of learning from mistakes. So here is that episode with Dan Pink. Episode 137, Daniel H. Pink, author of the new book, The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward.
Favorite is, I love the title of that because it forces you to think about it in a different way.
I'm Mark Rabin. This is My Favorite Mistake. In this podcast, you'll hear business leaders and other really interesting people talking about their favorite mistakes. Because we all make mistakes, but what matters is learning from our mistakes instead of repeating them over and over again. So this is the place for honest reflection and conversation, personal growth, and professional success. Visit our website at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. To learn more about Dan and how to order his new book, check out the show notes or go to markraven.com/mistake137. And now, on with the show. And I'm really excited today to have as our guest Dan Pink. He is a New York Times bestselling author. I had a chance to interview Dan back in 2010 in a different podcast series about his book, Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And he has a new book. We're going to talk about that and other things today. So before I tell you more, Dan, first off, thank you for being here today. How are you?
Mark, always a pleasure.
Well, I'm really thrilled, and congratulations in advance with the book. The title is, I believe this is the 7th book. The most recent that was released on February 1st is The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. That seems like a perfect topic to explore on the podcast. Now, you made a face. Did I get the number wrong? Is it 7 books plus?
No, you're totally right. No, you're totally right. You're totally right. I just know that you're going to ask me about my favorite mistake, and I'm cringing in advance.
Well, it's maybe an easier question than what's your favorite book, or that's a version of what's your favorite child. We won't go into that.
Right, exactly.
Dan has many books, and they've won. He's going to be embarrassed by this, but they've won multiple awards. Have been translated into, get this, 42 languages, and have sold millions of copies around the world. So you can learn more about his work and those other books at danpink.com. And Dan's had a really varied career. You were a speechwriter for Al Gore when he was vice president, correct?
Yes, long time ago.
Yeah. So Dan's done a lot of interesting things in his career, including that. So with that, Dan, what would you say, looking back at your career, has been your favorite mistake?
Well, yeah, favorite is, I love the title of that because it forces you to think about it in a different way. And as I thought about this, Mark, I think that my favorite mistake, because I think I've learned something, I think I learned a lot from it, obviously, is that career mistake is that I never, ever sought or cultivated or found or a mentor. I've gone through, I'm in my 50s now, and I've never really had anybody in my life who was a mentor. And I realized that was a mistake. And I realized the mistake I realized that at least the cause of that is not some cold and callous world out there, but that I didn't know how important that was. And B, I actually think that a reason that I didn't know how important it was is that I was too arrogant to realize that I needed it. And so the advice that I give to my kids is different because of that. And the way that I treat people who are coming up in the writing world has changed because of that.
So, at what point did you realize then that this was a mistake? This is one of those things where, was there a certain epiphany? Was it sort of a gradual recognition of the value of mentoring and how it would have helped?
Yeah, you know what? I don't really have epiphanies. I think these things occur. I think these things occur slowly. I think what I realized was that at certain points in my life, people had figured out various things, like how do you get a job? How do you get a job? Or how do you get a job working in politics? Or how do you get articles published if you have something to say? Or how do you go and find, if you want to write a book, like how do you go do that? And I realized that I didn't have and when I looked at other people, I first assumed that they somehow had figured it out themselves, when in fact what they were doing, they had a GPS. The GPS was another person who was helping them. The GPS was someone who was saying, hey, here's what the road looks like. There's a sharp turn over there. Watch out for that pitfall over there. And I was just like, hey, let's get in the car and go. And it ended up being really foolish. And again, I think what's important here, with mistakes, is that it's our fault. That is, I'm not saying, oh, I'm so disappointed that this didn't happen to me. It really was. It's like, wow, I should have known that. And also I should have been more humble about what I didn't know and done a better job of seeking help and counsel and guidance.
Well, when you talk about that being your decision, it's interesting. A lot of companies will propose, hey, you're a young employee. Do you want to have a mentor? Colleges, we're both graduates of Northwestern University. Northwestern
Indeed.
has an alumni mentoring program. So, I don't know if we can put all that responsibility on your shoulders. At some point, it seems like somebody should introduce the idea of mentoring to younger people. And then if that's rejected, I guess that's a different dynamic.
Yeah, I think so. And I really think that if I had, I truly wasn't offered it. And here's the thing: I'm a straight white man born in America. It's not as if the people who were in positions to quote unquote mentor me didn't look like me. That I was somehow excluded from that circle. So I think that's part of it. I also think, and again, I'm not sure this is accurate, but I think my guess is that it's accurate, is that if I had been offered it, I might have rejected it. I would have said, oh, that's for weaklings. That's not anything I need. This is stupid. I really think that my mind wasn't open to that. And deeper down at this mistake is the mistake of not knowing what you don't know, as cliche as that might sound, and not being open enough and not being humble enough.
So this makes me think, I was fortunate to have mentors, whether they formally had that label or not, earlier in my career. As I'm in my late 40s, I step back and think of like, well, I would probably benefit from a mentor today. I don't have everything figured out. You still have a lot of work ahead of you. Do you think at this point, is there somebody that could be a mentor to you? Is that something you would seek out now?
That's a really good question. And at some level, I've sort of, I don't want to say made peace with it, but what I've tried to do is I've tried to take pieces from people who I know and have worked with and who respect and how I respect. So it's not so much a singular person who is serving as a navigator for me. It's more getting direction from the experiences and advice of others. Now, that said, I have reached out to, as part of my humility, I have reached out to people, not to say, can you be my mentor or anything like that, but I can think of three people. I don't want to say their names, but I can think of three people whom I've reached out to recently, literally in the last year, where I've said, who are older than I. And I said, I feel like I'm following a path that's somewhat similar to yours. When you were where I am, kind of in the middle, which is where I am right now. When you were in the middle, like, what mistakes did you make? What do you wish you could do over again? What do you wish you had known? And so I've taken a few baby steps in that direction.
Well, and I bet you're working toward, knowing the type of work and the writing and the patterns that you find, you'll help the rest of us figure out, like, what's the most effective way to reach out to somebody with those.
Yeah. No, and I think there's a bigger point here. I mean, that you mentioned companies, Mark. I think we tend to the way we think of mentoring inside of organizations is that older people mentor younger people, and that people, say my age, in my 50s, don't need mentors. And I think that's a mistake. I think there's plenty of space for some kind of mid-career mentoring. And even the whole idea that a mentor has to be someone older than you might be wrong. That is, I can see a situation where someone who's 30 could mentor me in something that she knows. Now, it's kind of ridiculous, So, but that said, I'm like where I am in my life, where I'm like, I'm a professional. I'm going to be fine. The idea that I need to reach out to some kind of mentor seems a little bit foolish. That said, I am seeking advice, and I am trying to get it piecemeal from different kinds of people and their experiences.
So a mentor is a different depth of relationship with somebody, even if it doesn't have that official label.
Right.
We're going to go and find a certified mentor. I don't know if that's even a thing.
Yeah, that's the last thing that we need is we need some kind of professional body to certify entry into the mentoring profession. So
Dan's latest book again, and there's a transition here to compare mistakes and regrets. Maybe his book is The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. I mean, that's what guests have done on this podcast on My Favorite Mistake, looking backward, reflecting on a mistake and how that was a learning opportunity and how it moved them forward. With your favorite mistake, one other question about this. I mean, how would you label it a regret? Or maybe there's also a question of here, what's the difference between a mistake and a regret?
I'm not sure. I think that the difference is that regret is an emotion and mistake is an act. Yeah. And it could be that regret, built into regret, is some kind of mistake that you've made, and built into this emotion of regret, this stomach churning feeling that if things would be better, if only I hadn't acted so stupidly or made a bad decision or screwed up in that way. That emotion requires mistake, and the emotion of regret requires agency, which I think is true for mistake. Because your question is not what's the worst thing that ever happened to you. Your question is what's your favorite mistake. And so I think a mistake is in some ways embedded in a lot of regret. Like, for instance, like I was saying before, there's a difference between the thing about emotions. Okay, a mistake is really an act, right? Sure. It's something you did, and regret is something that you feel. It's a process that your brain and your goes through to understand, and it's giving you a signal about what matters in the world. And when we think about regret, there's a difference between regret and disappointment. Because disappointment doesn't have agency to it. So, for instance, here we go. You and I might be disappointed that Northwestern's football team had a terrible season this year. I am disappointed in that. Yes. But we can't regret that because we didn't play, we didn't coach. It's not our fault.
I mean, I could regret not figuring out a way to do a fifth fall at Northwestern, so I could have marched at the Rose Bowl. But I don't regret figuring out how to go as a fan that fall. Right.
So, right.
I mean, exactly, but there are regrets that emotion, and that is, I mean, you found in the research that you've done for the book, I mean, that's a standard human emotion that that we all feel and we all experience.
It is it is one of our most common emotions of any kind. And it is our most common negative emotion. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the lessons of this research into regret is that we sometimes don't treat negative emotions properly. We get a negative emotion and we sort of over-index on positivity and say, oh, no, I want to think positive. It's all about positivity. And that's a bad idea. By the same token, we don't want to take negative emotions as the only truth and wallow in them. And what you have to do is you have to approach these regrets in a systematic way. And I think that's really important. There's a triangulation here where we have some people who go around saying, no regrets. I don't have any regrets. I don't have any regrets. All right. That is insane. There are people without regrets. 5-year-olds have no regrets because their brains haven't developed. People with certain kinds of brain damage have no regrets because their brains are literally injured. So we don't want this philosophy. We don't want to get seduced by this sort of appealing philosophy of no regrets because that leads to delusion. But we don't want to wallow in our regrets either. We want to use them as signals to get better.
And I think that's one of the themes that we explore here on the podcast of reflecting on a mistake without beating ourselves up, like thinking about it without, as you said, wallowing in it. So, I think there are common regrets and the book lays out 4 common regrets. Mm-hmm. What's one of those 4? Maybe just to give a teaser of the book.
Let me take a step back and tell you how I got there, because I think it might be instructive. So there's a lot of research on regret in the academic world. Very, very good stuff and very, very interesting. And when they've asked the question, what do people regret? They've typically looked at the domains of life. So you say, oh, I didn't save enough money. Okay, that's a financial regret. I didn't, there's a financial regret or a career regret, or an education regret, or a romance regret, or a family regret, or a health regret, or something like that. It makes perfect sense. And what I found when I looked at that research was, and I did a piece of quantitative research of my own to try to get at that question, and ask people to put it in these categories. What I found is that there wasn't much guidance there. It was kind of all over the place. And then I realized there was something else going on, because I did another piece of research where I collected 16,000 regrets from people all over the world, a qualitative piece of research. And I started looking at those and I realized this. Let me give you an example. Let me actually answer your question. Let me give you one of them. All right. Let me tell you what I mean by this. Yeah. So I have people in this database of 16,000 regrets, a lot, literally hundreds, who regret being at a point in their life, finding someone who they were romantically attracted to, wanting to ask that person out on a date and not doing it, and regretting it 10, 20, 30 years later. Okay. I also have people who regret, huge numbers of people who regret not starting a business. Mm-hmm. I stayed in this lackluster job and I didn't start a business. Okay. That's a career regret. The first one is a romance regret. Let me give you another one. Let's go back to the college domain here for a second. I'm telling you, I'm going to give this to your listeners for free. There is a business to be started that is a travel agency that serves people who went to college and regret not having studied abroad. Okay. So that's an education regret, right? Mm-hmm. But to me, deep down, those are all the same regret. They're regrets about not taking a chance. They're people who look back and say, if only I'd taken that chance. And it doesn't so much matter what the domain of life is. The regret is about the chance itself. And so a big category in these deep structure of regret are boldness regrets. People, and I think what it reveals is that there's a fundamental human need to learn and grow and experience and lead a psychologically rich life. And when we're at a juncture in our lives where we can play it safe or take a chance, we're much more likely to regret playing it safe. And it's almost, and it's not even so much a privileged position there. It seems to be irrespective of our status in life.
So I'm trying to think then, So is that easier said than done? Like taking in that fact and that knowledge, and trying to think then, how do I translate that or remind myself, or do I print it on a coffee mug, or thinking of the things I'm going to regret in the future, the future inactions.
Sure. So that's actually a really, really interesting point about how do we anticipate our future regrets. And the thing is that that's a little bit tricky, because when we anticipate our regrets, we can actually make better decisions and lead happier lives, but we have to do it right. So you don't want to anticipate every regret. What car should I buy? Will I regret having a blue one or a green one or a yellow? What shirt should I wear today? Oh my God, will I regret? That what you want to do is you want to focus on these 4 core regrets, because these 4 core regrets, to my mind, operate as a photographic negative of the good life. Because if we understand what people regret the most, we understand what they value the most. So when you are making decisions prospectively, if you're at a juncture where it's a choice between playing it safe and taking a sensible chance, I truly want to recommend that you take a sensible chance, and that's a really important domain in which to anticipate your regrets. What color you should paint your house, what kind of car you have, what you wear, what you're going to have for dinner, whether you're going to walk this way to work or that way to work. Those kind, and we have, and the other part of this, and this research, Mark, but we make huge numbers of decisions in a day, huge, and there's a lot of research on what's called satisficing and maximizing. Mm-hmm. Do we want to maximize every decision? And the answer is no, we don't. There's research showing that people who are maximizers, try to get the most out of every decision, are miserable. Mm-hmm. We want to satisfy on certain things. And so that's true with our regrets. We want to anticipate the core regrets that reveal fundamental human needs, but we want to satisfy on everything else.
So is there a component of age? Somebody who's younger, by definition, probably doesn't have as many regrets because they haven't lived as much yet. There's I'm going to sound old in saying this, of like the young people and their talk of FOMO, fear of missing out, is a regret. Is there something you found in the research generationally or based on age, certain generations that have more fear of missing out or more potential regrets? I don't know.
It's a great question. Because in crunching the numbers and the quantitative part of the research, I found rather little difference by demographics. Mm-hmm. The one area, though, where I found some difference is age. Mm-hmm. And what it showed was that at age 20, we tend to have about the same number of action and inaction regrets. Action regret, I regret something I did. Inaction regret, I regret something I didn't do. But as we age, those inaction regrets pile up. They pile up. And the reason for that is that in some ways, action regrets can be more intense. So something like, I regret, I've heard so many stories. I have so many people who regret bullying kids in school. Mm-hmm. And I also have heard of many stories of people who bully kids in schools 10 years later, 20 years later, felt terrible about that and found the person they bullied and apologized to try to undo that. So certain kinds of action regrets we can undo. The same thing with certain kinds of action regrets is that we can actually we can do what I call at leasting them. That is, we can find the silver lining. And again, looking at this incredible trove of regrets, I have, again, so many regrets where people say it's almost all women. Truly, almost all women have this regret. I'm not all women have this regret, but the people who have this regret are all women. Yeah. I so regret marrying that idiot, but at least I have these 2 great kids. So they look for the silver lining in that. For inaction regrets, they're less intense. You can't undo them. You can't at least them. And so they linger, they stick, they gnaw.
So that sounds like, there've been times where someone will ask me for an example of what's your favorite mistake? And I don't know, one, not to sound flippant, I mean it. Like I took one job coming out of grad school where that wasn't the right job for me long term, but at least I met my wife working there. So there was a silver lining.
Right.
Yes.
But that's okay. But that's okay.
So it's not really a regret.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say that was a mistake in taking that job, but I certainly don't regret it because of the at least and the positive.
Right. Right. So what you've done is you've taken that. So it's an action regret. I did this, but I'm going to sort of take the sting out of it because I got this great at least out of it. And so, but with inaction regrets, they linger. That's the thing. And so inaction, and so what you see both in my research and in the academic research is that inaction regrets outnumber action regrets. But there is an age difference there.
So you talk about things where people try to fix an action regret. Inaction regrets, I mean, I can see where that sticks with you, where I can think of, without going into details, something I think about fairly often, where I was at a party, maybe just before the pandemic, and somebody made a comment that I thought was just really inappropriate, not toward me, but toward a group of people. And I froze. Like, I was just so dumbfounded to hear what was, it was a homophobic comment, like blatantly so. And it was from an older person. And that doesn't make it okay. But I froze. And I regret not being quick enough on my feet to know what or how to say to address that. So I think in thinking about that regret, I'd like to think I'm better prepared for, gosh, if that happens again in the future. I don't know. Is there anything from your research about dealing with an inaction regret like that? Because I feel bad for not standing up.
Okay. It's such a, okay. First off, Mark, you are not alone. There are so many regrets out there of people who say, I wish I had spoken up. I wish I had said something. I could go into, forgive me for being so like literal about this like database of regrets, but literally I can go into this database and search for the phrase spoken up, and we'll have bing, 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 bing. So many of those, which I think is something about, it's partly about, it's partly a boldness regret. Sometimes it's a moral regret too. We can talk about those in a second here too. So, but I think the real question is, what do you do with that? Okay. What do you do with that? And there's some very good research on this question. So one thing that is very clear is that talking about the regret, disclosing the regret is very helpful. Okay. There's a lot of research showing that and there are all kinds of interesting reasons for that. So one of them is that it lifts the burden. But one way it lifts the burden is that it takes something that is a little bit amorphous in our heads and converts it into words. And that aids in the sense making, because the words are less fearsome than these amorphous thoughts. So even writing about it can defang that. So one thing that you should do is actually to reveal it, to reveal it and disclose it. Now, one reason that we're loath to disclose sometimes, we're uncomfortable talking about our vulnerabilities, is that we think people will think less of us as a consequence. And what the evidence shows is that is wrong. People think more of us. They admire our candor. They empathize with us. They admire our courage. And so even like your regret there that you just disclosed, Mark, my hunch is that most listeners are not going to say, "Oh, you're such a wimp. What's wrong with you?" You're going to say, "God, you know what? I empathize with that. I admire, like, you thought that." And okay, so disclosure is one thing. Another aspect of it is something called self-compassion, which sounds a little touchy-feely, but you can take a regret like that and you can say, what I did that, but that's okay. I'm awesome. I'm the greatest. Okay. You can boost your self-esteem, or you can say, I'm the worst person in the world. Okay. You can be self-critical. What self-compassion, and this is the work of Kristin Neff at Texas, what self-compassion says is that, okay, here's what you have to say. Would you beat up a friend for doing that? No. Would you, do you think you're the only person who has this kind of regret? No. Do you think that all kinds of people have in the world, in the history of the world, have, wish they had spoken up? Of course they have. So what you do is you normalize it and neutralize it. Okay. You disclose it. And then finally what you do, which is really interesting, is you want to extract a lesson from it. And one way to extract a lesson from it is what's called self-distancing. So self-distancing is rooted in the idea that we're much better at solving other people's problems than our own. And so what we want to do is get some distance from that regret. So things you can do is like, if you confronted this, what would you tell your best friend to do with this regret? If you had younger people in your life, kids or mentees or something like that, what lesson would it yield for them? And so this process where you actually you don't boost your self-esteem and you don't rip yourself apart. You disclose it to make sense of it. And then you distance yourself from it to extract a lesson. That's how you deal with it. And that process is extremely healthy. That's how we make sense of our regrets. And that's how we use them to move forward.
Yeah. I think talking about it, and then, I think, people have come on this podcast and for one, being prompted to think about a favorite mistake, prompts them to tell that story. And we hope there's some comfort or healing that comes with that. But, I've got a coffee mug I've been sipping on with podcast logo here. And a friend of mine, Karen Ross, who was a guest on the show, kind of helped me develop some mantras that are printed on the backside of the mug. And it sounds like this idea of self-compassion or self-care and those questions you were asking. So it says here on the coffee mug, and I use these as reminders for myself: be kind to yourself. Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. The important thing is continuing to learn from our mistakes. There's a little bit of, there's a lot of self-compassion in those statements that Karen helped me put on that mug.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the thing is, it's like, and this is something that I learned myself. Now, so if you look at the research on self-esteem, we need some self-esteem. There's no question about it, but it's oversold. All right. There's all kinds of evidence that it leads to people not trying very hard. It can lead to foster sort of in-groups and out-groups. It can lead to kind of insidious forms of social comparison, et cetera, et cetera. Self-criticism seems logical, right? There's very little evidence. There's actually no evidence that it's effective. It's just kind of, it's sort of virtue signaling to yourself. The better approach is to treat yourself. This sounds a little Stuart Smalley, Jack Handey, but it's what the science tells us is to treat yourself the way you treat a friend. And we wouldn't tell a friend, the way we talk to ourselves, you idiot, what do you do? We don't say that. Well, we would treat them with some compassion. And then when we do that to ourselves, it allows us to disclose, which normalizes the regret and neutralizes it. And then we can take a step back and try to derive a lesson from it. And, and again, this is a process that should be normalized. It's something that we should just do as a routine part of our healthy living. And what's happened though, is that we tend to banish the regrets, to try to ignore them, or we don't know what to do. So they become debilitating.
So I think being open about mistakes or regrets is really helpful. You talk about, you shared earlier about how revealing those or expressing those generally makes you more liked than disliked. I think that's definitely true in workplaces. I think there's dynamics where, when senior leaders in an organization admit mistakes and that cascades downhill of creating a culture where people can speak up about mistakes so the company or the health system gets better. I don't know if this is too dangerous a territory to wade into, but I think of one group of people. I think of politicians. Like there are clearly, without naming names, there are politicians who should have regrets or probably do have regrets about actions or inactions. I wonder if there's any research if politicians who express regrets, is that political suicide or is that harmful to their standing?
I don't know whether there's any research on that. What my instinct would be, I don't know. Politics is different because it's such a hothouse environment. But my instinct would be that in a more normal, saner environment, back when I was working in politics, that sort of thing would be actually welcome. That it would be humanizing. That it would be authentic. That people would voters would respond to that. In this kind of environment, I'm not sure, because if you were to admit some kind of regret, it would be turned into a meme and put on social media and on cable television, and then you'd be doxxed, and it's just a mess. But that says more about the current political climate than it does about the values of disclosing regrets, offering some compassion to yourself, and then distancing yourself from them to extract a lesson.
It's funny, you would think back to those like 25, 30 years ago, that those were kinder, gentler times in politics. So it probably didn't seem like it at the time.
Listen, when I was working, you joke, but I'm serious. So when I was working in politics, one reason I got out and stopped working in politics is like, oh my God, this is just not like, this world is somewhat cruel. It is deeply unkind. There's a kind of brutality to it and coarseness to it that I used to admire, but I no longer, now that I'm in the belly of the beast, I no longer admire. And I don't want to stay in an environment where I might become like some of the people who I see. And I look back and like, oh, those were the good old days.
So there's no regret leaving political circles.
No, that one I don't have any regrets.
Well, thanks, Dan. Again, the book, the most recent book, is The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. One other question here. The timing of that research, was a lot of that pre-pandemic? And if so, do you think the pandemic has caused people to think differently about regret? In fact, that website, that survey is still open. I mean, are you seeing different?
Yeah, exactly. It's still open. We're still getting regrets. And I did do the research during the pandemic. I actually started the research pre-pandemic. I ended up doing the surveys during the pandemic. And what I found is that I don't think that the pandemic itself changed the substance of people's regrets. I think what it did, though, is that it might have made people more reflective than they would have been in other circumstances. So so just through dumb luck, it might have been a good time to talk to people about this, because their lives had slowed down a little bit, and they might be in a slightly more reflective mode. The times that the pandemic did come up in the conversations were in the responses that people gave were things like, my uncle died of COVID and I never got a chance to say goodbye, or my grandmother died of COVID and she had called me the day before and I was too busy and I didn't call her back. Sure. That kind of thing.
And there's a regret that unfortunately too many people have had. Kind of leads to a question of, do we learn from regrets expressed by others? The story, we see too many of these in the news of, sadly, sort of the deathbed regret confessional of somebody saying, I regret not being vaccinated. Look what happened to me. Don't let this happen to you.
Uh-huh.
Is that impactful toward those who might end up having that same regret?
I don't know. My guess would be that it is. And one of the things that you see is that when you get to a point in your life where you can't do anything about the regret, one thing that people naturally do is they try to transmit that lesson to other people. And so that could be a version of
and that comes back maybe to that self-compassion or the lifting the burden or some of the benefits that might soothe somebody while they're in the hospital and hopefully recovering, after they express the regret. But hopefully it influences others and there are fewer regrets like that. But that survey, worldregretsurvey.com, I played around with that website. I recommend people go there and you can click through state by state to see what people are putting in.
Yeah. And just see like the most recent 8 regrets that were contributed from Louisiana or from and other countries too. We have submissions from 105 countries.
And you can click through. At least when I looked the other day, Georgia and New Hampshire didn't have any entries. So I can't.
What?
I don't think live free.
I got to check that out because No. I think that's a glitch on our
Or it may have
end.
been user error on my part, but I was wondering if New Hampshire's slogan's now going to be "Live free without regret." But
no, I don't think so. No, I'm certain we have them from all 50. We have them from all 50 states.
I regret bringing that up because that could have been my fault. But you can, maybe you can go look into that. But it is a really cool website too.
I'll go check it out. Yeah.
Being able to click through by country or even by U.S. state and think about your own regrets. And I look forward to the book reaching my desk. It was released February 1st, and going to dig in and see what else I can learn. Dan, learned a lot from you here today, so I really, really appreciate you sharing and giving us a bit of a preview on the book.
Well, Mark, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So again, you can go to danpink.com. I really do recommend go through Dan's back catalog. The book Drive has been incredibly impactful for me, and that's a book I hear people talk about and reference a lot. So go check that out, learn about motivation. 20 years ago now, I think, Free Agent Nation. That was a pretty prescient book. Does that seem to hold up well? I read that a long time ago, and I've now been a free agent for a while.
Yeah. I think going back to my political days, I think I was a little bit ahead of the voters on that one. But, in 2001 saying that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be self-employed and working at home, and people said I was nuts.
Ahead of the curve. So maybe likewise here on regret. So the power of regret, how looking backward moves us forward. Dan Pink's been our guest. Dan, thank you. Thank you again for being here.
A pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks again to Dan for being such a great guest today. If you want to go check out his new book, available now, look for a link in the show notes or go to markgraban.com/mistake137. As always, I want to thank you for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to reflect on your own mistakes, how you can learn from them or turn them into a positive. I've had listeners tell me they started being more open and honest about mistakes in their work. And they're trying to create a workplace culture where it's safe to speak up about problems, because that leads to more improvement and better business results. If you have feedback or a story to share, you can email me, myfavoritemistakepodcast@gmail.com. And again, our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com.